Welcome everyone to our webinar today titled NACOE Local Government Heavy Vehicle Route Assessment Guide webinar series. Next slide, please. My name is Isabella and I'm moderating the session today. Next slide, please. We've planned to go for 60 minutes with time for questions. Next slide, please. We'd love to have your input. So you see here on the slide how to send your questions through. Now we're following the government guidelines and all coming from our home offices. So fingers crossed all our technology works, and we have Neva and Rosie from ARRB joining in today for tech support. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Our presenter today is Kieran Hay, Senior Professional Engineer, Transport Safety, ARRB. Next slide, please. And we have a few guest presenters today as well. David Milling, Team Leader, Transport Safety, ARRB. Mandy Haldane, Director, Structures Management, Engineering and Technology, Department of Transport and Main Roads. And we also have Larry Griffiths today, who is available for questions throughout the presentation. He is a Principal Engineer, Road Manager Policy, Heavy Vehicles and Prosecution, Department of Transport and Main Roads. Okay, let's get started. We'll now be hearing from Kieran.
Hey, Isabella, thanks for the great introduction. So I guess first of all, I just want to thank all the partners that were involved in their support with this project. So Department of Transport and Main Roads and the LGHVRAG and just the National Asset Centre of Excellence themselves. In saying that, I'm just going to hand over to Mandy Haldane for a moment just to give a little bit of background on why these guidelines were developed and how it all got started. Mandy, over to you.
Thanks, Kieran. So as a bit of a background to the development of the guidelines, the local governments collectively manage over 148,000 kilometres of roads in Queensland, compared to a state-controlled road network of around 32,000 kilometres. Local government therefore faces many of the same challenges as the state when it comes to managing the asset, especially regarding its condition, its accessibility, the reliability of it, and its safety. Since the introduction of the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator, local government has seen an exponential increase in the number of applications regarding heavy vehicle access requests for non-as-of-right vehicles. This has placed local government into a position where, due to limited resources, it is having to be act reactively in this environment. Local government has also been given limited timeframes to consider and respond to requests to meet statutory requirements under the Heavy Vehicle National Law. TMR have an established route assessment guideline for multi-combination vehicles document that historically has been used by a lot of local governments for assessments. However, there's no specific assessment guidance for some local government requirements, such as roads with lower AADT, unsealed roads, or local issues. So as a consequence, determinations are being made inconsistently between local government boundaries and between state and local government roads. In early 2016, the Local Government Association of Queensland, the LGHVRAG, undertook an exercise with 15 different councils to understand the issues involved with route assessment from a local government road manager's perspective. The outcome of the meeting led to two actions. One was the appointment of a dedicated heavy vehicle access liaison officer within the LGHVRAG, who is responsible for liaising between the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator, Department of Transport and Main Roads, and local governments on heavy vehicle access issues. The other outcome was the requirement for a risk-based assessment guideline. Later in 2016, further discussions occurred between Local Government Association of Queensland, the ARB and the Department of Transport and Main Roads through the Roads Alliance around the issues involved in granting access to restricted vehicles and the need for a risk-based guideline. Hence, this project was born. Next slide, please. The project commenced as a NACOE project, which is the National Asset Centre of Excellence Research Project in 2017. Several different discipline experts from ARB worked with myself as a TMR project manager and a reference group consisting of representatives from the LGHVRAG, the Transport and Main Roads Transport and Road Alliance, and Engineering and Technology, Structures, Road Design and Road Operations branches. Our aim was to develop a guide that would be suitable for use in local government roads by local government practitioners. The project started out by identifying the current national research that was available and the guidance that was currently available. And along the way, we identified that there was a significant gap in the available guidance and the knowledge of how to undertake a heavy vehicle route assessment. We also identified that local government personnel would benefit from training to understand the performance-based standards scheme, what should be considered in a route assessment, how to undertake an assessment, and how risk mitigation could occur, especially when a route comes up that it doesn't meet the actual criteria in the guidance. The material was gathered nationally, although there was a strong emphasis on the Queensland conditions. The draft guidelines were provided to local governments, including those in the Wide Bay Burnett Regional Roads and Transport Group, for comment. The feedback was then incorporated before the guidelines were finalised. So that gives you a bit of a summary on the background of how the guidelines were developed, and I'll now hand it back to Kieran.
Thanks, Mandy. Great background information there. It's always good to see where this guideline originated. All right, so I'll just hand over to David Milling, who is, I guess, the project leader on ARB's side of the development for these guidelines, and he'll just tell you a little bit about the guidelines themselves. Dave, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran, and thanks also to Mandy for taking the time to join us today and provide that background, and just highlight some of the challenges that there are with heavy vehicle route assessments on local government roads compared to state-controlled roads. I also wanted to give a specific mention for Susan Barlow from the Roads Alliance, who's been involved throughout the journey of creating this guide, and has been a great liaison between the project team and those local governments, and also to Robbie Chow from the LGHVRAG. So we really did value their input so that we could have a truly collaborative approach. So with respects to the guideline as it stands, it is a comprehensive guide. It builds off existing assessment guidelines and criteria as outlined in the TMR guides, NHVR guides, and some other state road authority guides. However, as Mandy mentioned, it's tailored to assess access on local government roads. It does consider those low volume, low speed constrained environments, as well as unsealed roads. So the document is quite large. It contains a lot of detailed information which existing state road authority road assessment guidelines don't contain, or as not in as much detail, and that is to help an assessor identify that when the criteria is demonstrated to be met, what other criteria on that section of road is met, and that enables a risk-based approach. So it's the guideline provides, as Kieran will demonstrate later in this webinar, provides a lot of detailed values which don't necessarily have to be calculated from first principles. So we've incorporated a lot of guidance from the Austroads Guide to Road Design, and provided that guidance specific for the heavy vehicle, multi-combination vehicles and PBS vehicles that you might be assessing a route for. Throughout the guideline, particularly for the geometric assessment components, we've provided a number of suggested mitigation treatments that can be applied where the guidelines aren't strictly met, and that can be considered in a risk-based approach. So it's really about enabling local government to make a determination on whether access is appropriate, so whether it meets the criteria within the guideline, and if it doesn't strictly meet the criteria in the guideline, there's a recognition that it is a guideline, and that if you can quantify what your risk is and identify what your level of risk acceptance is, it may well be suitable to provide access with gazetted access, or whether it be access under a permit. And we've also provided a Excel-based route assessment form and route upgrade table, which helps you navigate through the document. And at this point, I'll hand back to Kieran to start to go through the detail in the guide in some level of detail. Thanks, Kieran.
Thanks, Dave. Great to hear from you. All right. So the heavy vehicle route assessment guideline project itself, as Mandy and Dave said, it operated through the National Asset Centre of Excellence, which is a joint collaboration between ARB and the Queensland Department of Transport and Main Roads. So it turned into a bit of a 3-year project. where the first year was the development of those guidelines that have now been delivered online. The second year is doing these webinars so that we can try and show what that new guidance is in comparison to the existing state and national guides. And then year 3 will be to deliver a little bit of support to the users of the guide. So there is a email address that you are able to send feedback to based on that route assessment form, and I believe also the guidelines themselves. So there is going to be a little bit of support on the back end of this. All right, so to the webinar itself. So as you probably already know, this is a 5-part webinar series. It's aimed at conveying that new guidance presented in the guidelines. So this table here just shows a schedule for each webinar and a bit of a brief description of what's covered in each section, as well as the dates for each webinar session. So this webinar itself, or this webinar session itself, is primarily going to cover an introduction to the guide and mainly the new tools that are being developed to use alongside the guide. So a lot of the specifics about the new guidance is covered in webinar sessions 2 to 5. And this slide here basically just shows an overview of what sections in the guidelines will be covered in this webinar session. And each of these sections has new guidance in them in comparison to existing guides. And during this webinar, we'll touch on each of these sections. But the key additions that will be discussed in this webinar are the new guidance on heavy vehicle fleets and vehicle types, and the use of the route upgrade table and route assessment form. And we'll get into that in a bit more detail. So I guess let's start off with the question, what is the purpose of the guide? So the guide is designed to assist users in the assessment of routes for the suitability of heavy vehicles operating under the heavy vehicle national law. The goal of the guide is to ensure that all relevant factors shown on the right are considered during the route assessment process. So these factors include the geometric performance, road safety, structural capabilities, pavement capabilities, and amenity considerations. And this guide has been developed based on the most recent research available, the latest reference materials, and years of practical experience by those that are involved. So it has become one of the most comprehensive guides available. However, it should be noted that this is a guide only, so road managers are able to adapt these guides to their own unique situations. And things like risk assessment processes can be undertaken to provide access where assessment attributes do not meet the guidelines. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in, I believe, session 2. And this table here just shows a little bit of a description of what's included in each of those assessment types. So we'll be going over this a little bit more in this webinar series. All right. So I guess first things first, who are the parties involved in heavy vehicle access? So I'm sure everyone knows by now that the NHVR, or the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator, is kind of the governing body behind heavy vehicle access, and they review and facilitate the heavy vehicle access process and grant final access permits or notices for vehicles if they are satisfied that it will not pose a risk to safety, if each relevant road manager has consented, and if any other consents required have been obtained. Road managers are made up of state and territory road transport authorities, local governments, and any other road owners such as ports or forestry agencies. Consent from road managers is required before any access notices or permits can be granted. So that is, I guess, why we're all here. Under the Heavy Vehicle National Law, road managers are required to provide that consent. So anytime there is new access requests, it's I guess the road manager's job to assess that, to work out if it is safe, and then provide either an acceptance or a refusal of that access request. And finally, the Queensland Department of Transport and Main Roads, who is the road authority in Queensland and is responsible for transport regulation. They also act as a road manager for all state-controlled roads, and they have the power to, I guess, overrule local government access decisions. However, as far as I know, this has not happened so far, and I'm sure they, want to leave it up to local governments to manage their networks. All right, so the next thing is, I guess, vehicle types and productivity, and I'm sure most people here already know these vehicle types and vehicle classes. However, we'll just do a quick little revision just in case anyone's new to the heavy vehicle space. So as you may or may not know, there are 3 classes of vehicles under the HVNL. So these are Class 1 vehicles, which includes vehicles such as special purpose vehicles, agricultural vehicles, and oversized overmass vehicles. You've got Class 2 vehicles, which are freight carrying vehicles typically longer than 19 meters in length. And this includes vehicles such as your B-doubles, road trains, PBS vehicles, and buses. And the last one is Class 3 vehicles, which are vehicles which, together with its load, does not comply with a prescribed mass or dimension requirement, and is also not a Class 1 heavy vehicle. So it's a little bit of a tricky area, this one. So an example of this is a heavy rigid truck, which is carrying a 2.65 meter wide precast concrete pipes. So this vehicle is actually over 2.5 meters wide, and it's carrying more than one item. So it doesn't really fall into the Class 1 category. So these guidelines themselves are specifically designed for Class 2 vehicles. So that's, again, the freight carrying vehicles over 19 meters long and your PBS vehicles. And you'll see that all examples throughout the webinar are for Class 2 vehicles only. So we don't really touch on Class 1 or Class 3 in these guidelines. So this table just gives us a better look at what vehicles are covered under the Class 2 of heavy vehicles. So Class 2 heavy vehicles can be grouped into 3 main groups. So you've got your general access vehicles, such as vehicles under 19 meters. You've got your restricted access vehicles, such as typical B-double combinations, your Type 1, Type 2 road train combinations, which I think are called slightly different things depending on states. And then you've got your PBS access vehicles, which is your performance-based standards vehicles. And they're divided into levels 1 through 4B, which you are able to see on that chart on the right. So restricted access vehicles and PBS vehicles are the main vehicles we'll be looking at throughout the webinar. And you can see in the table on the right that there is a relationship between these 2 types of vehicles, as PBS vehicles can be compared to their equivalent prescriptive vehicles. As an example, a typical 26 meter B-double is comparable to a PBS level 2A vehicle and vice versa. So if access is given to, say, a B-double 26 meter vehicle, then the same access should be able to be given for a PBS level 2A vehicle. So when applying these guidelines and assessing for new vehicles, the document itself provides a relatively simplistic table of assessment criteria that may need to be assessed based on what existing vehicles are operating on your networks and what vehicles have been requested to operate on your networks. So this can be used to determine what criteria need to be assessed. So for example, in the table on the right there, this is just a small, I guess, snippet of that entire table. So this is looking at general access vehicles being the only vehicle accessible on the road network. And then it looks at potential new classifications. So you can see that PBS level 1 vehicles don't really require any additional assessment, whilst upgrading to a B double or a PBS level 2A vehicle does require additional assessment based on that. And the route upgrade table tool that we've created also provides a slightly more detailed version of these tables, and it's a little bit more interactive. And you'll see that shortly in this webinar session. All right, so the guide itself is designed to be as user-friendly as possible. And I guess some of this is being based on I guess, the usability of the Austroads guide. So a lot of this information is provided in easy-to-use table kind of formats, rather than providing a whole bunch of formulas that everyone has to calculate manually, or having people rely on first principles to do that kind of assessment themselves. So it is fairly straightforward on how to do those assessments. So as I said, all the route assessment is undertaken primarily using attribute tables. I think there is a couple of graphs in there that can be used. And like I say, it just minimizes the use of manual calculations, which we all know kind of ends up becoming quite time intensive. And if you are assessing quite a long route, then the route assessment process just increases exponentially, or the time that it takes increases exponentially. So in most cases, the assessment is performed using the type of vehicle as a variable. So in the table on the right there, this is just looking at an extract for the B double or PBS level 2 vehicle type. So there's also another section of this table which is for type 1 road trains and also PBS level 3, and then also type 2 road trains and PBS level 4. And each of those has, I guess, different criteria for the vehicle type, which results in different guidance. So additional guidance and drawings are provided to assist in the understanding of each attribute. So in this example, we have stopping sight distance. So we've provided diagrams that really show you how to measure that stopping sight distance and how to collect that information, and then also provide the tables on the right to actually find out what the guidance is saying that you should have. And this slide here provides a bit of an example of that. So first step you really need to do is just determine what the relevant variables are. So in this case, for the stopping sight distance, we've got 3 variables that we really need to identify, and that's your vehicle type, your operating speed, and also your grade. So for this example, we're just looking at a B double with an operating speed of 80 kilometers per hour, and the road grade is -6%. So we've already measured the existing stopping sight distance on a road, and it's come out to be 230 meters. And then we can compare that against the recommended guidance in the table. So the blue rectangles and lines kind of show us how we find that information. So for 80 kilometers and a -6% grade, we can see that the recommended stopping sight distance is 195 meters. And then we can just simply compare the measured stopping sight distance against the recommended guidance. So obviously 230 meters is greater than 195 meters. So this passes that assessment. So that means that that vehicle meets the requirements, or that route, I should say, meets those requirements for that vehicle type. So yeah, it is quite a simple process to go through and do. And I guess the overall time really depends on what vehicles you're coming from and what vehicles you're going to, as that kind of changes how much you need to assess. And you'll see a little bit more about that when we start talking about the route upgrade tables and the route assessment form that we've created. So we'll just take a quick break and answer a few questions if any have come in. Isabella, have we got any questions that have come in so far?
Thanks, Kieran. Yeah, we've actually had a few come through. The first one being from Brad, and they've asked, is there an HV route usage status site that shows visibility on what routes are currently being used / by what projects? This would assist upcoming projects in assessing risk and preparing a TMP and a route preferred LGHV route selection.
All right, that's a bit of a difficult question. If I'm understanding it correctly, I don't think there's any website that shows like upcoming projects from companies mapped out to show where they're happening. There is the NHVR's route planner, which does show what routes have been gazetted or what routes are available via a notice for each different type of heavy vehicle, so PBS level or BWYs. But in regards to an actual project level, I guess, map, I don't think so. I can look into it and find out. I'm not too sure if Mandy or Larry would know if there is one available. Otherwise, yeah, I can have a look into it and get back to you after the webinar.
It's Mandy here. I believe there. It's Mandy here. I believe there is a CSIRO have a map that's available that it doesn't show which projects, but it shows what commodities are using different routes. So you can look at a section of road and it can tell you how many tonnage of freight for livestock or for sugar or cane or beer even. It tells you kind of what commodities being moved and how much is being moved on each route. And that's, I'm pretty sure that's a CSIRO product. I think it's Transmac or something like that it's called.
All right.
Might be something you could look into, Kieran, and provide some feedback back on after.
Yeah, well, as far as I understand it, all these questions will be recorded. So yeah, if we didn't answer the question as well as we could, we can always send a follow-up email to you and let you know if we found anything. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks,
any other
Kieran.
questions?
Yeah, we've got another one come through from Leanne, and they've asked, is a bus only class 2 if it's over 19 metres? Some of our local buses are currently 12 metres long. Are they still classified as a class 2?
Yeah, so I believe 12.5 metres is actually, I think, the limit. I'd have to double check on this one. But I believe it's anything over 12.5 metres for a bus is still classified as a class 2, I believe. And I think there's also certain situations where it can be a class 3 vehicle. Again, I'd really have to double check that. So I may not be able to give as much information right now as possible.
No worries, thank you. We have another question from Brad, and they've asked, modular buildings, how do we over width up to 3.5 metre wide loads get classified? Class 3, or is it addressed in the guidelines separately?
So anything that would be a class 3 or class 1 vehicle isn't really assessed in this guideline, so we won't really be touching on that too much here. But I'm more than happy to follow up that question after the webinar.
No worries, thank you. And we've also got a question from Matthew, and they would like to know where the guidelines are available from.
Yep, so we have uploaded the guidelines onto the NACOE website. I don't know if I've actually put a link into the website, but if you go onto Google or Bing, whichever one you prefer, and search for the National Asset Centre of Excellence, that should take you to the NACOE website. And then up on the top menu bar, there is a section for guides. This will take you to the page that has all the guides that are available, which I think this is the first one. And then all you got to do is just enter in your, I guess, name and company. That way we can kind of keep track and let you know if any updates come through. And then this will let you download the guideline and the tool.
Perfect, thank you. And we've got a question from Mike, and they have asked, are all the gazetted layers on the NHRV website, e.g. PBS level 2A layer, have they all had a full route assessment?
Yeah, so I believe anything that is classed as PBS, well, any PBS level has been assessed by local government road managers, and then that's how it gets gazetted. So the typical process for that is someone will typically ask for access to a road network or a road itself, and then if the local government is happy for any of that type of vehicle to operate on that road, then they can give access via a gazette or via a notice, and then it will get added to the NHVR's route planner layer. So they should all have been assessed, yes.
That would be true for anything past 2007, because in 2007 is when the performance-based standards scheme come in. Anything prior to that, that was when it came in 2007, the Department, Transport Main Roads, worked with Local Government Association, and we went and had a look at all routes that were existing B-double or road train routes were automatically transferred over to be PBS level 2 and PBS level 3. They may not necessarily have had an assessment in the past. They may have been approved based on local knowledge or some other reason they've been approved. It wouldn't necessarily be a complete assessment, but anything post 2007 would have had a complete assessment done.
Awesome, thanks for the follow-up on that one, Mandy.
Thank you. So we'll do one more question and then we'll move on. This is from Tara, and they've asked, what level of consultation occurred during the development of the guide? Was NHRV involved? Council reps? Thanks.
I know NHVR was involved in the consultation to some degree, but I'll probably have to pass over to Mandy on this one so that she can give you a little bit more information on, I guess, how many people were involved in that consultation and what groups or organisations.
Yep, so as part of the project, we had a reference group that had a number of different representatives on it. Robbie Chow was a representative from the Local Government Association. When we had the guidelines at various stages throughout, actually, we consulted through the Wide Bay Burnett Regional Roads and Council Group. So they provided quite a bit of feedback as the guidelines went along. And then once they were ready for final comment, they went out to, I don't have it off the top of my head, but there was a number of different local councils that went back to provide feedback into just providing comments on the guideline before it was finalised. And yes, the National Vehicle Regulator were involved in providing comment as well.
Yep, and it should be noted that this guide was developed, I suppose, specifically for Queensland. However, that does mean that it can also be used in other states. So I believe all the consultation that did occur was specifically for Queensland local governments. Is that correct, Mandy?
Yep, that's correct.
Yep. All right. Perfect. All right, well, I think, yeah, we might move on from that, and we've got another question section coming up soon, so we can try and answer a few more questions then. All right. So during the development of the heavy vehicle guidelines, we were also requested to create some tools to assist local governments in the route assessment process. As a result of this, we created 2 Excel-based tools to help you with the route assessment process. So these are the route upgrade table and the route assessment form, which have now been combined into one spreadsheet. We looked at using different types of software. How we figured everyone has access to Excel, so it's probably easier for us to make a tool in that software, just so that I guess we can reach as many users as possible rather than trying to force people to install new software and or use web-based tools or anything like that. And I guess that's why that decision was made to stick with Excel. So the upgrade table assists the users in determining what attributes from the guidelines need to be assessed, while the assessment form provides a very high level assessment of a route using worst case scenarios from the route that is being assessed. So we'll be looking at both of these in more detail shortly. However, it is important to note that we do not intend these tools to be used in place of the guides. They're simply tools developed to assist you in using the guidelines themselves and should always be used in conjunction. So yeah, that, I suppose that is the key thing there. The tools are not standalone tools. In a lot of cases, they will refer you back to the guidelines depending on the situation. All right. So the upgrade table is a high-level tool which helps determine which attributes of the route needs to be assessed, and it's based on the concept of upgrading from one vehicle or route type to a greater proposed vehicle or route type. For example, if your road network is only using general access vehicles, so 19-meter semi-trailers, for example, and you're looking at opening access to 26-meter V doubles, that would be like the time that you use this tool, and it would assist in telling you which attributes would need to be assessed, and we'll show a little bit of that shortly. So by default, when you first open up the attribute table, it's basically saying that all attributes should be considered for assessment. Once you do input those current and proposed vehicle types, it will change to show which ones definitely need to be assessed. So anything that does need to be assessed will kind of highlight in orange, and anything that may not be required will highlight in green. And then anything that is in the black color will should be considered. And again, you know, this is kind of a guide and should be used in conjunction with the guide. And also, you know, it still does require engineering judgment from the user to be used in parallel. So the upgrade table will recommend general assessment of certain attributes regardless of the vehicle inputs. This is due to these attributes not being reliant on the vehicle type itself. Therefore, they can be assessed at the discretion of the user. For example, if traffic considerations have already been looked at and assessed for a comparable vehicle, then they may not need to be assessed again. And it's one of those things where it does require the user to just double check that before they make that decision. So in the scenario that we have here, so we're looking at moving from general access to PBS level 1. So in Queensland, this is I guess considered a like-for-like vehicle type. And what this means is that they are equivalent or comparable in performance, and no assessment really needs to take place for that due to TMR policy decisions. However, this does only apply for Queensland, and other states may have different policies. So you should always double check that. Like I said earlier, this guide was developed specifically for Queensland. However, you know, all the guidance that is provided in there can technically be used in any other state. But yeah, things like the policy decision shown here, that is a Queensland based policy though. So when we do look at this table here, we can see that pretty much everything is kind of highlighted green. There is still a lot of black there because things like traffic considerations and amenities, it's not specifically vehicle type dependent. So it does still need to be considered. Things like amenities, where it's looking at adjacent land use, that could be really dependent on the volume of heavy vehicles, not necessarily the type of heavy vehicle. So it could still require an assessment. Things like structures, this one really depends on the vehicle type. If it's a PBS vehicle that's operating above the general mass limits, then it could still require an assessment of structures. But in regards to the road geometry, which is really what this tool itself focuses on, a lot of those considerations we don't have to look at. And this is just another quick example of the tool. So in this scenario, it's upgrading from general access to 26 meter B double combination. And now we can see that there is quite a number of things in the road geometry section that is highlighting in that orange color. And this indicates that an assessment of these attributes is required. So it does, this tool does make it quite easy to see which sections of the guide you need to be looking at. Like we saw before with the general access to PBS level 1, it's quite a simple procedure as there's not a lot of assessment required in the road geometry section at least. Here though, we can see that there is a lot more assessment that would be required. And I guess in the situations where you're upgrading from something like a B double 26 meter to a PBS level 2B vehicle, which is 30 meters long, you'll also see that it'll have less assessment requirements. It'll only really require you to assess anything that is really vehicle length dependent. So things like stacking distance or turning lane lengths. And yeah, when you start using the tool, you'll see that in more detail. So I'll just open up for any quick questions about that assessment, the route upgrade table, and then we'll go on to the route assessment form. And I do have one last question session at the very end there. So I'll just open up for a couple of questions here.
Thanks, Kieran. We've had a question come through from Ashish, and they have asked, has LEDD01 condition on NHVR portal modified recently?
I'm not very familiar with the condition that Ashish is talking about. That's something I may have to answer offline, unfortunately.
No worries. And then we've got a question from Atene, and they have asked, where are these tables from?
So these tables are based on the guidance that has been provided in the new heavy vehicle route assessment guidelines. So we've basically gone through that document and found where, I guess, a higher level of attribute requirement is required for different vehicle types, and then based on that, we've created those upgrade tables. So for example, something like lane width, we're basically just comparing the requirements for a B double against the requirements of, say, a PBS level 2A vehicle. And if the requirements are the exact same, then there's no need to perform that assessment. However, if we were looking at something like the B double in comparison to a PBS level 3A vehicle or a type 1 road train, then there would be a difference in the lane width requirements there. And then we can identify that there is like an assessment required to upgrade to that larger vehicle type. And it's basically the same for all the other attributes. Yeah. Dave, I don't know if you want to add anything else on that. I think that kind of covered it off, but yeah.
Yeah, look, I think what I would add to that is the purpose of creating the upgrade table was just to identify that you don't necessarily need to assess every single component or attribute along a route. And as Kieran mentioned, that's in recognition of if you already have a certain vehicle operating, it's previously been assessed, and there isn't a demonstration of any issues, so safety issues, pavement structures, or anything like that. If as a road manager you're satisfied that it's been previously assessed, everything's operating well, then you can move on to really just focusing on those gaps as it would be, which is what the route assessment table identifies.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dave. And yeah, I guess that's the real purpose of having that upgrade table in there, is to, I guess, really streamline the process as much as possible, where you're not having to do assessments that really aren't required. And a good example of that is the B double to the 2A vehicle. A lot of assessment isn't required for that because a lot of the outcomes are exactly the same. So we've tried to streamline that process and shown that you don't have to do a lot, like every single assessment type. But yeah.
Perfect.
Any
Thank
other
you, Kieran.
questions there, Isabella?
Yeah, we have one from a teen as well, and they would like to know from the previous set of tables as well, where they were from and what design guide were those contained within.
So are we talking about, I'm guessing we're still talking about the route upgrade table. So as I mentioned before, those were developed based on the current guidance in the heavy vehicle route assessment guidelines. And yeah, I guess if you do have any more questions around that, yeah, feel free to chuck a comment into the chat window and I can respond to you after the webinar.
Perfect. Thanks, Kieran. We don't have any more questions at the moment.
All right, perfect. I'll move on. All right, so the last section of this webinar session is going to look more at the route assessment form itself, and then we'll do a quick example at the very end. So the route assessment form is a guide which determines the compatibility of road geometry to the proposed vehicle, and it is a high-level route assessment, essentially. So all the assessment formulas that run in the background are assessed against the proposed vehicle type from the route upgrade tables. And it basically just goes through and calculates what the recommended guidance is from those guides and compares that against the values that have been entered into the table to work out if you're exceeding them or if you're within them. So essentially if it passes or fails. And like I said before, it is a very high level route assessment process, and it does work off, I guess, worst case scenario. So as you can see in the table on the right there, it only allows you to enter, I guess, one sealed road into your into the assessment. And what that means is that you have to pick the worst case scenario. So I guess the narrowest sealed road with the highest AADT volume to determine if that passes or not. And then I guess the theory behind that is if that worst case scenario passes, then anything else on that route should also pass. So the form itself has been set up so that it will flag any areas of assessment that were identified in the route upgrade table. And as I mentioned earlier, these two tools are in the same assessment, are in the same Excel sheet or Excel workbook. So you first enter in those vehicle types into the route upgrade table, and then that carries over to the route assessment form. So it will actually flag any attributes that you do need to go through and definitely assess. And again, this spreadsheet should be used as a guide only, and engineering judgment should still be used in parallel to the tool. And again, this tool can be found with the guide on the NACOE website. So inside of the route assessment tool or the route assessment form, there is an instruction sheet which does show how to enter values into the table. So yeah, those just need to be entered as per the instructions. And like I said previously, the values are based on that worst case scenario along the route for that attribute. And we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail in the example. But it's basically, yeah, looking at your entire route, finding out where that worst case scenario is and assessing for that. And if you pass for the worst case scenario, then anything else should be better than that. So everything else should pass as long as you've identified the worst case scenario correctly. So the tools themselves provide recommendations based on the entered attributes. So in those shaded blue areas, I've got an example here on the bottom of this table. So right now they are blank because we haven't put any values into that table. We'll see in the example shortly that those do change and update based on the values that you've entered. And then also the results can be printed to PDF for record keeping purposes. So if you do an assessment on a specific route or a specific road, you can then print this to PDF or even save a separate copy, whichever way you want to go about it. So you can have it for record keeping purposes. So later on, if anyone was to try and dispute a refusal or something like that, you can open this up and easily show that that route assessment did have issues, or there were certain attributes that didn't meet the guidelines, or there wasn't a way to mitigate those risks. And I'll just answer one or two quick questions here, and then we'll try and power through to the final example. I know that we are coming up on the end of the webinar.
Hi, Kieran. We don't have any questions that have come through at the moment, so let's keep pushing.
Perfect. All right, I'll power through to the next one. So this is just going to be a brief example of how to use that tool. So as I mentioned before, it is a high-level assessment tool, and right now we're going to be doing a high-level assessment of an unsealed rural road using that upgrade table and that route assessment form. And this will show, how to put that data into the tools and understanding the recommendations made by the tools. So that image below, so that's actually going to be our worst case scenario formation width for this route. And for this example, we are only going to be looking at the formation width. Unfortunately, there's not enough time to go through a whole assessment. But it does show a general overview of how to use this tool. All right. So first things first, we just need to use the route upgrade table to see what we do need to assess. So currently, we're just assuming that this route is general access only, and we're then looking at upgrading access to that B-double 26 meter or PBS level 2 access. So all we need to do is go through and select those options in the table, and all of this is kind of drop down boxes, so you don't have to manually enter it or anything like that. You can just click a little drop down and pick from the list. And the tool itself really only considers the geometric attributes of the route assessment. So that's what we'll be looking at in this example. So when we put that into the table, so our general access and B-double vehicle, we can see which attributes we do need to assess. So this is basically saying we need to assess the formation width on the mid block. So that's exactly what we're going to do. So this is just an aerial photo of the route that we've been asked to assess. And a lot of this is in quite a rural area. So it is unsealed roads here. So the first thing we really need to do is go through that route and select the narrowest formation width along the route segment to assess. And we've done that in the image. So we've kind of zoomed in on a section of the route, and around there is where the narrowest section is. And you'll see a photo of it shortly. And like I said before, if that section is the worst possible scenario for formation width and it passes our assessment, then all other unsealed road sections should also pass the assessment as long as it's been done correctly. So assessing for formation width using the route assessment form. So first of all, we need to collect some information about the section we wish to assess. You know, it does still require user input when doing the assessment. So we need to get the measured values for the speed of that road, the AEDT, what the carriageway specifications are, and then also what the formation width is. So in the example here, this is looking at a relatively narrow section of unsealed road. It's got a 7.2 meter formation width. So then we go into the assessment form and we can start plugging in that data. So when entering this data, a lot of the times it's either you select from a drop-down box or you just input a numerical value. So it is pretty straightforward. Anything that does have like a dash on it just isn't required for that assessment that you're doing. And you can see that in the unsealed straight sections there. There are a few things that aren't really considered in there. So for this route type, we did find that the operating speed of that road is 60 kilometers per hour. Our AADT was 70 vehicles. Unsealed road, undivided carriageway, single lane two-way. And our carriageway width that we measured was 7.2 meters. So once we've plugged all that data in, the table will kind of show us what the final result is. So in the route assessment form, if the attribute doesn't meet the requirements of the guidelines, it will tell you to refer back to the guide for further analysis or to consider mitigating measures. In a lot of cases, there is additional guidance provided in the guides. So for unsealed roads, there is a section that discusses low speed, low volume rural roads, which does provide slightly narrower requirements for the carriageway width depending on site distance. So if we were to refer back to the guide, that may be something that we can use to provide access. Alternatively, we could undertake a risk assessment for this area of route to see if there is any way that we can mitigate the risks and provide access still. And it could be something as simple as putting in some signage just to alert users that there are heavy vehicles on that route. So there are multiple ways that you can go about this. And I believe with this assessment here, the guidelines does say that the carriageway width should be 7.6 meters or greater. If we went through the guide and actually did additional assessment, we would find that there is the option to use a lower order road requirements. And I believe it's 7 meters. I'd have to double check, to be honest. But that does allow us to grant access to this road based on the fact that it is such a low speed road and there is a very low AADT for that road. And these options will be discussed further in section 3 and session 3 and session 4 of this webinar series. So we'll go over these geometric additions that we have, and also the risk assessment process. All right. So that's almost the end of the session. So I'll just open up for any final questions, and then we can wrap the session up.
Thanks, Kieran. I think we've got time for 1 or 2 questions. So we've got a question from Zahid, and they have asked, what pavement impact assessments are considered and how are the assessments done?
Yeah, so there is a section in the report which does discuss the pavement impact assessments. I personally didn't write the section or anything, but it does have a comparison between existing vehicle types and new vehicle types to work out if there's any additional impact to that pavement. That's a question that I'd probably have to get back to you about if you want some more information on it. I'm not fully across that section of the guide.
I'm happy to chip in there, Kieran.
Yeah, Dave, if you want to jump in, yeah.
Yeah, so there is a section within the guide that covers pavement impact assessment. It considers pavement deterioration and also on the mid-block sections, and also to consideration to the effects of shear stress on small radius curves and in intersections. So there is some guidance there and some examples in the guide that demonstrate how you would undertake the assessment. And as Kieran mentioned, it essentially allows you to quantify what the standard axle repetitions would be based on the existing vehicle access and then the vehicle access that you're looking to grant. So if, for example, you were going from a PBS level 2B vehicle to a level 3A vehicle, and you were confident that that level 3A vehicle would reduce the number of trips resulting, that would be required from the 2B vehicle, the pavement impact assessment would reflect that. And that will be covered in session 3 or 4, I think, Kieran. 5.
Yeah.
So the last webinar session we'll go through that in detail.
Yeah, we do provide a bit of guidance. In the actual guidelines themselves, there is quite a significant amount of guidance in there. In session 5 of the webinar series, we will discuss the pavement assessment in there and what that process is, and also provide an example of how to undertake that. But yeah, so if you do want some more information on that, feel free to ask us a question and we can get back to you. Otherwise, there is some guidance provided in session 5 of the webinar series.
Thanks, Kieran. And we'll just do one more question before we finish up. And this is from Ching. And they have asked, are there any tools to assess turnaround or U-turn and roundabout for rural route and industrial areas? As reversing is hard to implement, maybe only a very skillful or experienced truck driver.
Yeah, so the guidelines does discuss low speed swept paths in the geometric assessment section. Dave can probably provide a bit more information around the low speed swept path side of stuff, but yeah, it is considered in there. I don't know if we drill down specifically to U-turns. I know we definitely do talk about, I think, roundabouts in there, but Dave, yeah, I think you'd probably know a bit more about it than I would.
Yeah, look, there's a number of tools available where you can simulate or overlay a heavy vehicle swept path. Some have limitations with U-turns with respects to what turn radius you use. You have to be attuned to what the steer angle and the performance specifications of the vehicle are that you're wanting to assess. Otherwise, the simulations may not reflect the reality. Within the guideline that we're looking at, we're predominantly looking at low-speed swept path manoeuvres through intersections, not necessarily within the last mile or first mile location, starting and end point.
Yeah, and Larry, did you have anything to add on that one at all?
Not much, but there are two tools that TMR tends to use on a fairly regular basis. One is an in-house tool called VPath, and the other one is, I think a lot of your users will be quite familiar with him, is AutoTurn, which will help you analyze the swept paths.
Yep, perfect.
Perfect.
All right, well,
Thanks, Kieran.
I think we've pretty much run out of time now, unfortunately.
That's all right. Would you mind just going over to the next slide, please? Perfect. So thank you to our presenters today, and thanks to our audience for tuning in. Our next NACOE webinar is on the 23rd of July, so tomorrow. Please check our website. We have so much happening in the online space, and we'd love to have you join us with anything that might enhance your personal, professional development and build your CPD points. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, Isabella. And thank you, Larry and Mandy, for joining us for the webinar.
Pleasure. Look forward to the